Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive. Today we're journeying into the mind of a philosopher who, well, pretty much tried to solve everything. Imagine just one brilliant intellect setting out to reconcile the biggest philosophical questions ever asked. Free will and determinism, idealism and realism, the finite and the infinite. We are plunging into the astonishing, sometimes really audacious philosophical universe of a true giant, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. You've brought us some absolutely fascinating material today. It's this rich tapestry woven from Leibniz's really deep reflections on what reality is fundamentally. So our mission on this deep dive is to navigate his complex ideas. We'll start by asking, what truly makes up the universe? From the most basic indivisible bits, all the way up to composite bodies like tables and chairs and even the animals we see around us. We're going to try and uncover his genius for synthesis and reconciliation. Understand how he connected things that seem totally unrelated and how he challenged, well, everything we thought we knew about substance, matter, perception.
Yeah, and what's really captivating about Leibniz is exactly that reputation as the great reconciler. He wasn't someone who shied away from a complex philosophical fight. Far from it. He tended to engulf dilemmas, always looking for alliances between ideas that seemed totally opposed. Like he famously tried to merge Plato's idealism, the world of perfect forms, ideas known through reason, with Aristotle's realism, which anchors reality in concrete, observable stuff. It's this incredible approach, constructing novel combinations, connecting the seemingly unconnected. That's the real mark of his genius. You see it everywhere: philosophy, theology, even politics.
So he wasn't just watching philosophical battles from the sidelines. He was down there, actively trying to build bridges across them, sometimes using intellectual blueprints that looked completely incompatible.
That's amazing.
And it perfectly sets up this core tension we're going to explore throughout this whole deep dive, right? This constant back and forth between idealist and realist viewpoints within his own thinking. It's almost like he's seeing the universe through two different lenses at the same time, both powerful, always aiming for the bigger picture. Okay, let's unpack this journey into reality. Leibniz says we should start with the most undeniable thing there is, our own inner experience, the I. He argues the most basic metaphysical fact, the sort of irreducible starting point, is that I exists as an active real unity that perceives and strives.
Mm-hmm.
These are his monadic predicates, essentially the core inner states defining us. I act. I am real. I am one. I perceive. I strive. And he claims these are true even if you are literally the only finite thing in the entire universe. It's a bold place to start, isn't it? Deeply internal.
It really is.
Yeah.
And this primacy of the I, it isn't just about how we know things, epistemology. It's about what fundamentally is, ontology.
Yeah.
Leibniz seriously considered the solipsism dilemma. That unsettling idea that your whole life could just be a perfectly convincing dream, that nothing else exists, no bodies, no other substances, just you, the thinking person. In some early writings, he even says it's possible in itself. It really makes you question everything.
A perfectly coherent dream. Wow. It's like those advanced VR simulations. If the illusion is good enough, how could you ever be sure it wasn't just you? So how does he get out of that hole? If he admits it's possible, how does he reject it?
Well, ultimately, he rejects pure solipsism, not because it's logically impossible exactly, but because he finds it not consistent with the primary reasons of things.
Mm-hmm.
His argument here leans on a theological principle, God's sufficient reason. Why, he asks, would a perfect God create only you? Just you, when so many other more perfect thinking substances could exist? God would lack a good enough reason for such a, limited creation. And this argument, interestingly, survives into his mature work as a reason for believing in an infinity of minds, or monads. Building on this, he gives us two first principles of sensation. First is the familiar Cartesian one. I who perceive exist. The cogito ergo sum. But Leibniz puts more weight on the second principle, which he finds much more fruitful. The things I perceive are various.
Various, meaning different, diverse.
Exactly. The sheer variety of our perceptions, all the different colors, sounds, feelings, thoughts we experience. He argues the reason for this variety must come from outside the perceiver. This, he believes, leads us directly to knowing there's a world beyond just the self. It bridges that gap from purely internal experience to an external reality.
That's fascinating. So the very richness and diversity of my inner world becomes the escape hatch from solipsism. It's not just that I perceive, but that I perceive so many different things. And that difference demands an explanation outside of myself. It really makes you wonder, though, if our deepest certainty is just our own existence and these varied perceptions. How confidently can we step beyond that? How do we know we're stepping into a shared external reality? For Leibniz, it seems the structure of our inner world itself points outward. Okay, so having grounded things in the eye, Leibniz then takes aim at what isn't fundamental reality. He was especially critical of Cartesian mechanism. Descartes tried to boil everything down, all the qualities of bodies, color, taste, hardness, to just pure extension, just spread out as
quantity.
And Leibniz found that completely implausible. His implausibility argument basically asks, how could sheer quantity just being spread out, like an empty box, be the ultimate reality? How could a world full of rich qualities like warmth or sweetness or even consciousness itself possibly spring from that? He called it radical emergence, meaning qualities just pop into existence from nothing.
Pretty much,
Uh-huh.
without any intelligible explanation. For Leibniz, a bankrupt hollow shell can't just magically produce objects packed with qualities. He insists qualities must arise from qualities somehow. You can't get something from nothing, qualitatively speaking.
Okay, so if reality isn't just quantitative extension, how does Leibniz bridge that gap? How do we understand the qualities we perceive out there?
This is where he talks about privileged access enriched by reason. Our own inner experience, he argues, gives us powerful analogies for understanding the outside world. For instance, knowing ourselves as a composite unity one, I made of many internal states, helps us grasp non-human composite unities, like, say, a donkey or a tree. Similarly, our direct internal awareness of being goal-oriented, of striving towards things, lets us understand other teleologically driven things, angels, God, even biological processes, as having purposes or ends.
And our internal feelings help too.
Crucially, our direct acquaintance with felt solidity, that feeling of pushing something and it pushing back, impenetrability, inertial resistance, these help us understand those same qualities in external objects. He actually criticized John Locke on this point. He argues Locke looks for solidity on the wrong side of the football, meaning Locke looks for it out there in purely objective primary qualities, instead of starting from our internal experience. Leibniz thinks this gets Locke stuck in a deeply segregated worldview. In Locke's view, your internal feeling of solidity can't really tell you about objective reality if that reality is just primary qualities fundamentally different from your subjective feelings. For Leibniz, our inner experience isn't some isolated bubble. It's a vital key to unlocking the objective world.
It's an interesting idea, that inner analogy. But does it really close the gap? I mean, it still feels like a big leap from my feeling of solidity to the objective fact of solidity out there. Does his analogy bridge really hold up? Or does it risk just projecting our internal states onto the world? It makes you think. How much can our subjective experience truly tell us about the objective world? What kind of bridge could genuinely connect them?
All right, so we've started with the I, rejected pure extension. Let's go deeper. What is matter ultimately made of? This is a huge question. Fundamentally, is it gunk or is it simples? Yeah, those are basically the two main camps. Gunk, metaphysics, is the idea that everything is infinitely divisible into parts of the same kind. Imagine like a blob of homogeneous gunk. Every tiny bit you take is still the same kind of stuff. Material, extended, divisible. You can keep dividing it forever, conceptually, and never hit rock bottom.
Like a fractal or something.
Kinda, yeah. Descartes' pure extension fits this model. Or thinking of matter as just a phenomenal appearance that you can infinitely subdivide into smaller appearances. It just keeps going.
But if it just keeps going down, infinitely divisible gunk.
Yeah.
How does anything end up being truly real or solid? It seems like it would just dissolve.
Exactly Leibniz's point. He argues forcefully against this infinite divisibility. If something was divisible through and through, meaning every part could be further divided forever, he argues it would fritter away to nothing. It would basically dissolve into non-being. A body made only of infinitely divisible parts would be nothing but an appearance. For anything to have true reality, genuine being, there must be indivisible foundations at the bottom. Simples. And these foundations can't themselves have size or be debatable, or you just push the problem down. It's interesting how this philosophical debate kind of mirrors science, isn't it? Science discovers smaller particles, quarks, leptons, but always leaves open the possibility there's something smaller still, maybe underlying gunk. Metaphysics, though, at this level, has to rely on what Leibniz might call firm conceptual hunches. Logical arguments, not just observation. Historically, you had atomists like Democritus, Newton, Locke. They also argued for simples, indivisible, unalterable, permanent, completely solid corporeal existences. Tiny, hard bits of matter. They also went beyond observation.
And Leibniz, characteristically, takes this idea of simples but flips it completely. Instead of physical atoms, he argues for mental simples, monads. That feels like a huge shift.
It's a profound shift. And for Leibniz, any good theory of simples has to meet two really important conditions or burdens. First, the individuation burden. These simples have to be qualitatively distinct. You need a way to tell them apart inherently, not just by where they are in space and time, because Leibniz rejects absolute space and time as fundamental.
Traditional atomism struggles here, right? Its atoms are often identical, just differing by location. They lack unique inner properties.
Okay, so they need unique identities. What's the second burden? The supervenience burden. This is crucial. All the qualities of composite things, a rock's hardness, a flower's color, a body's motion, must intelligibly arise from and be fully explained by the properties of the simples that make them up. You can't just wave a magic wand and get complex qualities from blank, generic simples. As Leibniz says, variegated composites can't arise out of blank, homogeneous, qualitatively bankrupt simples. Atomism, trying to explain blue or sweet just by the shape and motion of colorless, tasteless atoms, faces this yawning chasm, this huge explanatory gap. How does motion become color?
And he even calls those atomistic simples gunk in sheep's clothing, right? Arguing they aren't truly simple.
Exactly. He thinks they're still complex, just treated as one for convenience. He asks, what reason can anyone assign for confining nature in the progression of subdivision? Why stop the dividing arbitrarily?
This really forces the question, what has to be the absolute bottom layer for reality to make sense? Can something truly simple, with no parts, give rise to everything complex we see? It's a fundamental puzzle. So, we land on Leibniz's answer, monads. These are the fundamental constituents. He defines them as simple substances, no parts, unextended, indivisible. They are, he says, the true atoms of nature and, in a word, the elements of things. A radical departure from physical atoms.
Totally radical. And since they have no physical properties, what defines them are their internal states. Leibniz focuses on two key ones. First, perception, which isn't necessarily conscious awareness like ours. It's more like a fundamental internal state that represents the entire universe from that monad's unique point of view. A multiplicity in the unity, as he puts it. Second, appetition. This is the internal principle, the drive that causes change, the passage from one perception to another within the monad, a kind of internal striving.
So if you define soul really broadly as just anything with perception and appetition, does that mean all monads are souls?
In a sense, yes. Leibniz suggests all created monads could be called souls. They exist in an infinite hierarchy of grades, from complex human minds, maybe angels, all the way down to what he calls naked monads. These have very basic, perhaps unconscious perception and appetition. They might be the constituents of, say, a rock.
Wow. That leads straight to panpsychism, doesn't it? The idea that mind or mind-like stuff is everywhere, fundamental to reality.
It does. Leibniz boldly projects an analogy between us and the constituents of a rock. He suggests all of nature ultimately supervenes on this single mental substrate. And this is critical for that supervenience burden we talked about. If composite things had qualities that just emerged out of nowhere, not traceable back to the simples, the whole explanation breaks down. Monads, with their inherent qualities of perception and appetition, were supposed to explain all the variety and activity we see in bodies.
It's a powerful image. You mentioned that Michelangelo analogy, like the divine touch giving life. In Leibniz's realist view, substance, monads, reaches forth and touches aggregate, imparting reality to it.
And he has arguments for these monads existing, right? Arguments that try to prove these non-physical things from physical observations.
Yes, and they often have this interesting structure. They start from observations about the physical world, but argue for something non-physical. It's like digging for physical explanations and finding metaphysical ones instead. He's trying to ground matter in mind, which, as we'll see, creates that central tension. Take his divisibility argument. He observes that extended bodies, like this desk, seem infinitely divisible. But for them to be real, they must ultimately be composed of non-extended, truly indivisible unities, substances, monads. Otherwise, they'd fritter away to nothing.
So reality needs an indivisible foundation, right? Then there's the reality argument. Things that have derivative reality, like the desk, whose reality depends on its parts, must get that reality from things with primitive, fundamental reality. The substances.
Right.
Reality has to come from reality. Similarly, the activity force argument. Bodies move, they resist, they have derivative activity and force. This must come from primitive activity and force inherent in the substances. And finally, the aggregate argument. Aggregates, collections like the desk, and all their qualities are nothing but collections of simple substances. Their qualities must come from the qualities of those simple ingredients. So simple substances with qualities must exist. Basically, you can't get something from nothing.
But as Bertrand Russell pointed out, there's a kind of inconsistency here, isn't there? Russell saw it with piercing clarity. These arguments often start with very realist assumptions like extended bodies definitely exist. But they conclude with these idealist implications. The very substances Leibniz introduces to explain matter seem to threaten to dissolve matter into just mental phenomena. Russell said matter gets gradually transformed into psychology.
That's the core tension Russell nailed, and it's crucial. The premise often assumes a mind-independent physical world, but the conclusion points towards substances that make mind-independent bodies seem almost redundant or just appearances. So, for you, the listener, this raises a huge question. If the ultimate building blocks of everything are these mind-like points of view, these monads, what does that actually mean for our everyday experience of a solid physical world? Can the mental really be the foundation for everything?
Okay, so if monads are the fundamental, non-extended, mind-like bits, how do they actually combine to form the bigger things we experience? Things that seem extended and physical. This gets us into mereology, the philosophy of parts and wholes. How are things put together? And Leibniz definitely rejects the Newtonian picture of atoms bumping around in absolute space and time.
Absolutely. His substances, the monads, aren't extended, so they can't be put together in space. And he views space and time very differently anyway. For Leibniz, space and time are ideal. They aren't fundamental realities themselves. They're more like conceptual grids or mental frameworks we use to mark out possible relations and parts. Bodies, in contrast, are supposed to be real.
So space and time are just in our heads, ways of thinking.
More or less. He sees them as prior to their parts. In our concepts, we grasp space as a whole before dividing it up mentally. But they're arbitrarily divisible. You can slice and dice space and time conceptually however you like. And that very flexibility makes him suspicious about their ontological integrity, whether they're really real independent things. He thinks they're abstract idealizations, safely tucked away in reason, ultimately reduced to mere conceptual structures in rational minds. Plus, making space and time fundamental would create a problem, wouldn't it? It would mean they compete with God as the ultimate ground of reality. Leibniz can't have that.
That's a radically different view from how we usually think of space and time as the basic stage for everything. And it connects to his critique of extension itself, right? He argues extension isn't fundamental either.
Exactly. He has a couple of key arguments against extension being primary, beyond the divisibility one. First, the conceptual argument. He claims extension isn't basic, it's derivative. It can be analyzed into more fundamental ideas like continuity, plurality, coexistence. Now, some critics find his reasoning here a bit, well, assertive. Like he's defining it this way because he's already decided extension isn't basic, rather than proving it rigorously, driven by his goal.
Okay, what's the other argument?
The reality argument. This says extended things get their reality from other things that have primitive reality, namely substances. He argues it's nonsense to talk about something being merely extended without some underlying quality that fills it out, that marks out its area or volume. That quality has to come from the substances. But both these arguments, the conceptual and the reality one, they really lean on the realist aggregate thesis, the idea that bodies are genuinely composed of substances. Because if bodies are just idealist appearances, continuous and subjective, they can't really be bolstered by mind-independent substances in this way.
So extension isn't primitive, it gets its stuff from the monads. This leads to a really important distinction he makes between something being divisible versus divided.
Yeah, this is subtle but key. Divisible fits best with ideal things like space, time, geometry. It refers to possible divisions. You can imagine dividing a line forever. Divided, though, implies something already done. Actual, fixed, determinate parts. And Leibniz insists that matter is actually infinitely divided into simple substances, or souls, or animals, not just infinitely divisible.
Actually divided, meaning the divisions are real, not just potential.
Exactly. And this claim of actual division is really tough for purely idealist interpretations. Idealist appearance bodies, being just phenomena, can't logically be divided into substances in a real metaphysical way. This emphasis on actual division strongly suggests bodies have a real foundation in underlying substances.
It's a fundamental distinction, and it makes you think, if space and time aren't fundamental realities, just conceptual tools, what does that mean for the framework we use to understand the physical world? It completely flips our intuition. Okay, so this brings us right to the puzzle of aggregates. If the world is fundamentally made of these simple, non-extended monads, how do they come together? How do they form composite things like diamonds or rainbows or herds of sheep or even just a brass ball? What gives these collections their unity?
This is exactly where the split between idealist and realist readings of Leibniz becomes incredibly stark. You find passages that seem to point in completely opposite directions. In some texts, the idealist ones, he argues that aggregates only exist as phenomena within minds. The mind perceives a collection of things and portrays it as unified and extended. The mind plays a vital role in actually bringing the aggregate into existence as a unified appearance. This fits nicely with his canonical Metaphysics, where bodies are reduced to mental phenomena.
So the unity is imposed by the mind.
In that view, yes. But then in other passages, sometimes even right next to the idealist ones, he sounds much more like a realist. Here, aggregates are treated as mind-independent because they contain mind-independent substances. They're actually divided into these substances, and their qualities, like hardness or color, supervene on or arise from the qualities of the substances within them. These realist texts support the aggregate thesis that composites are really made of simples and get their reality from them.
And he has that saying, doesn't he? What is not truly one being is not truly a being either.
Exactly. That axiom really fuels the fire. Unity and being are convertible. So if an aggregate lacks true inherent unity, if it's just a collection, that its unity, and therefore its very being, can only exist in our mind. It's a unity based on how we perceive the relations between the real substances. This is the core of a phenomenalist view of aggregates.
So aggregates become fundamentally ambiguous in his work. It's like one of those optical illusions. Which way you see it depends on how you look.
Precisely. And it forces you, the listener, to ask, does a pile of sand have true unity? Or is its oneness just something our minds create for convenience? What does it actually take for something to count as a single genuine being, rather than just a heap of parts we've grouped together?
All right, let's lean into the idealist side for a bit. If we interpret Leibniz mainly through that lens, how do we understand these aggregates, these everyday objects like chairs and trees?
Okay, the first and maybe most extreme idealist take is reductive phenomenalism. The claim here is simple but radical. Talking about physical things, about bodies, is only talking about perceptions. The whole universe is basically just a vast, harmonious stream of perceptions happening in all the mind's monads that exist. Bodies aren't out there, they are the perceptions. It's a full-blown elimination of physical bodies as independent things.
So a chair isn't a thing, it's just the consistent perception of chairness shared across many minds, coordinated by God.
That's the idea. Commentators like Montgomery Firth see Leibniz this way. Firth talks about a deepest ambivalence in Leibniz between this phenomenalism, bodies' perceptions, and the aggregate thesis, bodies' aggregates of monads. Firth, being an exclusivist idealist, basically picks the phenomenalist texts as the real Leibniz and dismisses the others as inconsistent. For him, the true monadology is just this harmony of perceptions.
But that raises questions, doesn't it? Where do all these perceptions come from? What makes them consistent across all these different minds?
It does raise big questions. And the weakness of this view is that it leans very heavily on theological arguments. It needs an infinity of monads perceiving harmoniously, and the main argument for that infinity comes from God's goodness. God wanting to create all possible grades of minds. It kind of lacks strong non-theological arguments because those often rely on the realist ideas that phenomenalism throws out. So while Leibniz's version with infinite monads might seem more robust than Bishop Berkeley's reliance on just a few human observers plus God,
right,
it still ultimately rests on us assuming those theological premises about God's nature and creative choices. If you grant those premises, the difference between Leibniz and Berkeley here starts to look a bit smaller.
So, if bodies are only perceptions, what's the thing that makes my perception of this table match your perception? What's coordinating it all? It pushes you to look for some underlying order, even if it's just divine decree. #####3.2 aggregates as mental constructions. Okay, moving on from pure phenomenalism. Another idealist approach sees aggregates more as mental constructions. This sounds a bit different, like we're actively building them in our minds.
Yeah, it has a kind of Kantian flavor to it. Aggregates don't just appear to us. They arise when the mind actively constructs them, often unconsciously, by grouping certain perceptions or substances together. Leibniz himself says aggregates have their unity only in our mind. He describes how our mind notices or conceives some genuine substances that have certain modes, and then takes the occasion to join them together in thought and enter into the account one name for all these things together.
One name, that sounds important. Does it mean language is involved?
That's the implication. This view suggests that only minds capable of language and reflection like humans can perform this act of construction. You need a concept, a name like dune or flock, to bundle the perceptions or substances together and make the aggregate exist as a dune or a flock. Without the name, no dune.
So a dog can perceive a stick as an aggregate in this sense, because it doesn't have the concept stick.
According to this interpretation, yeah, that's a tricky consequence. The advantages are that it fits some of Leibniz's writings, especially his letters to Arnold, and aligns with his basic idealist metaphysics. It also lets us understand the principles of aggregation, because we are the ones doing the aggregating. We could, in theory, figure out the rules we use. But the downsides are pretty big. It excludes animals and lower monads from perceiving aggregates, which seems counterintuitive. It leaves a lot of the realist-sounding text unexplained. It struggles to give aggregates a subject we can predicate properties of mind independently. And how do these mental constructs persist over time? Their existence seems entirely dependent on our thinking them.
Wow. It puts so much weight on the perceiving mind. Our world becomes this kind of internal collage we're constantly creating. It makes you ask, how much of the unity we see in things, a tree, a cloud, is really in the thing, and how much is just our concepts, our language imposing order? Challenges the idea of objective unity itself. Hashtag 3.3 aggregates as well-founded phenomena. Okay, the last main idealist view, and maybe the most common one, is that aggregates are well-founded phenomena. Phenomena bene fundata. Sounds sophisticated. What does it mean?
It means they are appearances, phenomena in the head, but they aren't just random illusions. They are well-founded on something real outside the specific perception, namely on other monads. So they have a kind of objective grounding even though they exist as phenomena.
So appearances, but reliable, grounded appearances.
Exactly. This view starts with the epistemology we experience phenomena and adds a metaphysical layer. These phenomena are grounded in, or well-founded on, other mind-independent monads. It differs from mental constructions in two main ways. First, it involves other monads as sort of remote quasi-causes of the phenomenon. The phenomenon depends on the existence of an underlying monadic aggregate, a collection of monads, even if there's no direct interaction between these windowless monads. It's a kind of dependency relationship, sometimes called a Cambridge relation.
A Cambridge relation, meaning the relation isn't a real change in the things themselves.
Right, it's more about how things stand relative to each other or how they're described. Second, this view drops the strict linguistic requirement of mental constructions. Any mind, even one without language or reflection, like a dog's, can initiate or perceive these well-founded phenomena. A dog can see a stick as a phenomenon, even without the concept stick.
So real phenomena are just these coherent perceptions that fit with our other experiences and what others report. And the idea of the perceptual continuum explains why they seem extended.
Yes, exactly. The seamless flow of our perceptions creates the appearance of extension, which Leibniz sees as a fabrication in the mind. Similar to how we might think of color as just an idea, not an inherent property of objects, the advantages are strong. It preserves the core idealist metaphysics. It allows for a kind of causal theory of perception, though based on quasi-causation. It has good textual support, and importantly, it allows all monads to perceive aggregates as phenomena.
But what are the weaknesses? It still sounds like aggregates are ultimately just appearances.
They are, and the weaknesses are significant. Like mental constructions, there's no truly mind-independent thing that the properties of the aggregate belong to. They belong to the phenomenon. Realist texts are still left unexplained. The quasi-causation link between the underlying monads and the phenomenon feels weak and makes the actual monad seem almost irrelevant to the appearance itself. And maybe most importantly, the continuous nature of the phenomenon, the extended appearance, seems fundamentally inconsistent with Leibniz's core idea of reality being built from discrete, simple unities. Monads. How can a continuous appearance be grounded in discrete simples? It creates a deep tension with the simples metaphysic.
It's a very subtle position, trying to have it both ways maybe. Can something be truly well-founded in reality but still exist only in the mind? How solid is that line between appearance and reality if the appearance is so robustly grounded? It keeps blurring the edges. Okay, we really dug into the idealist side, where aggregates are mostly mind-dependent phenomena. But the texts you brought suggest a powerful realist alternative, a whole different theory where the universe is genuinely mind-independent, containing not just monads, but also real aggregates, composite objects, and animals. This feels like a major shift in perspective.
It is. It's a competing hypothesis, a distinct way of understanding Leibniz's world. In this realist picture, the monads, while borrowed conceptually from idealism, change their character. They lose that world-apart, windowless isolation. They're now seen as capable of entering into some kind of intimate contact, not spatial contact, obviously, but a real connection with other monads, substances, and aggregates. This opens the door for real relations between things, not just apparent ones.
Like real causation, real composition.
Exactly. Real causation between substances, or at least mediated through bodies. Real composition, aggregates being genuinely made of substances, and real supervenience relations, where the properties of the aggregate genuinely arise from the properties of the substances that make it up.
So the monads aren't just lonely points of view anymore. They're actively interacting, building a real external world. This must mean a different understanding of parts, too, right? Bodies aren't just bits of space. They're made of substances.
Precisely. The aggregate thesis becomes central here. There are many texts where Leibniz explicitly endorses it, stating that bodies, aggregates, presuppose or contain substances. They draw their reality, their activity, their force directly from these underlying substances. He uses analogies like substances being parts of an army that make up the aggregate. He argues bodies will not be real pluralities unless there are contained in them and composing them substances. These are strong claims for a mind-independent physical reality grounded in monads.
But the big question remains. If substances can truly interact and compose things, how do these non-extended mind-like entities actually build the extended physical world we see? It implies a kind of composition that's really hard for us to visualize, totally different from things fitting together in space. Hashtag 4.2 aggregates as the SS, simplistic realism. So let's look at the realist options for aggregates. Maybe start with the simplest one, the SS, which just means the substances. The idea here is that an aggregate is nothing but the collection of substances it's made of.
Right, that's the most minimalist take. It's driven by a kind of nominalist impulse. Don't multiply entities beyond necessity. Just say the aggregate is the sum total of its constituent substances. Leibniz sometimes uses language that sounds like this, contrasting an aggregate with a substance by saying it's not a substance, but substances. The idea is if the substances are mind-independent and the aggregate is just identical to them, then the aggregate must be mind-independent too.
Sounds neat, almost too neat. What's the catch? A table feels like more than just a swarm of invisible monads.
The catch is pretty decisive. Non-extended substances simply cannot, by themselves, entail the existence of something extended. Leibniz is clear. Aggregates are extended, substances are not. So an identity claim the aggregate is nothing but the non-extended substances is logically impossible. This strongly suggests that when Leibniz says a body is substances, he's using hyperbole. He means it depends on substances or results from them, not that it's literally identical to them. This simplistic realism just can't explain the extended world we experience. It's too reductive.
Yeah, it's like saying a brick wall is nothing but the individual bricks. It misses the arrangement, the mortar, the wallness. Can a collection of parts ever truly be the whole, or is there always something more? This view seems to just ignore that something more. Hashtag 4.3 Mereological sums. Okay, if aggregates aren't just the substances, what about thinking of them as Mereological sums? Like your sandwich analogy. Bread plus ham plus bread. The parts added together.
That's the standard way we think of sums, but it hits a wall immediately in Leibniz's system. His basic parts, the monads, aren't in space, so you can't just line them up side by side contiguously. The plus sign in a Leibnizian Mereological sum can't mean spatial addition. It would have to signify some kind of non-physical, metaphysical glue, some abstract principle of aggregation that bunches these non-spatial substances together. They'd need some internal feature to fit together non-spatially.
What about bringing in relations themselves as parts, like trope sums, where the relation between the parts is also part of the sum? For the sandwich, it would be slice 1 plus ham plus slice 2 plus the relation of contact and betweenness holding them together.
That's an interesting idea from modern Mariology, treating relations, tropes, as parts. But Leibniz would likely reject it forcefully. His idealist side has a strong doctrine against accidents in two subjects. A property for him must belong entirely to one substance. The idea of a relational trope with one leg in one substance and the other in the other was anathema to him, and a trope trying to link the infinity of substances needed for an aggregate. That would be a monstrous infinipede, a metaphysical absurdity violating his core rules about properties residing wholly within individual substances. It's another clash between realist needs and idealist principles.
Man, his own rules make it so hard to put things together. Even common sense ideas about sums don't seem to work easily. It leaves you wondering, how do we account for the unity of a composite object if its fundamental parts are distinct, non-spatial, and seem unable to share properties like relations? We're still searching for that metaphysical glue. All right, this leads us to a more complex, maybe more promising realist analysis. Aggregates as rigid embodiments. What's the core idea here?
The core idea is that an aggregate isn't just a pile of substances, nor just a sum. It's a whole composed of specific components, substances, linked by a specific relation. Let's call it R. Think, slice ham, slice R. R is the formal element, the sandwich maker, that provides the structure and unity. And rigid here means that at any given moment, the components are fixed. It's these specific substances related by R that constitute this specific aggregate right now. It's not a loose collection.
Okay, but what is this relation R, metaphysically speaking? It can't be just a spatial relation.
Right. Initially, you might think R just describes the arrangement from afar. But for Leibniz's realism, R needs more punch. And it's to be a meddling relation. It needs a kind of trope-like aspect, an individual reality that actively affects aggregatehood. It has to somehow meld the substances into a new thing. But R also needs an intentional or conceptual element, a predicative function. This means there's also an abstract, perhaps linguistic aspect to R that makes it appropriate for us to refer to these components together as a specific kind of whole. They are understood to agree to form, say, a diamond. It connects the metaphysics to our concepts.
So R is doing double duty, metaphysically gluing things together and conceptually allowing us to grasp them as a whole. This sounds like it leads to direct supervenience embodiments.
Yes, this is absolutely key for the realist view. Direct supervenience means R establishes a real metaphysical link between the substances and the whole aggregate. Let's call the whole W. It's a vertical link. And it's strong enough to transfer analogous properties, reality, activity, force from the constituent substances up to the whole aggregate W guess. This is how substances lend their reality and power to bodies, making nature active without needing God to step in for every little movement. This is a huge payoff for the realist theory.
But doesn't this violate Leibniz's own idealist rule about no influx, that monads can't directly affect each other? A real relation R linking substances seems like influx?
That's the standard idealist objection. But the realist argues that direct supervenience requires the whole aggregate W to be mind-independent. R becomes a real irreducible relation connecting the mind-independent substances and the mind-independent whole W. And Leibniz actually provides a precedent for such relations himself, God's act of conserving creatures. He accepts that as a real, irreducible relation between God and creation. If that's possible, the realist argues, then other real, irreducible relations, like the supervenience relation R, should also be possible within his system. It carves out space for real connection.
That's a clever way around the objection. But if R is this deep metaphysical glue, how do we ever know about these aggregates? We don't perceive R directly.
Good question. This is where F comes in. Leibniz introduces F to represent a term in our natural language, like extended body or diamond. F is how the aggregate is known or designated by us. R is the underlying metaphysical reality. F is the conceptual or linguistic lens we use to see it. R itself, the real structure, is mostly independent of our language. The form of dinosaur existed before we coined the word. But our judgments about the aggregate, is it persisting? Is it moving? Is it solid? These depend on judgments about W, using the concept F, like W is the same F, the same diamond I saw before. And these judgments can be wrong, of course. Importantly, only minds capable of reflection can access W through these F concepts. A dog might recognize a stick, but not via the abstract concept stick.
So the final picture, this rigid embodiment analysis, blends everything. The metaphysics, the epistemology, even the way we perceive extension.
Exactly. Aggregates, Ws, are objects constituted by substances, S, linked by a real direct supervenence relation. F, our concepts language, allows us to conceive W and attribute qualities like extended body to it. The perceptual continuum explains why we attribute extension or perception smooths over the underlying discrete reality. But W itself, metaphysically, is an actually divided aggregate of discrete, non-extended substances. It only gets characterized by extension when perceived as such through F.
The advantages seem pretty significant. It fits the realist texts, gives a clear story about supervenience, makes sense of actually divided bodies, and provides an inside-out metaphysics where inner monadic qualities explain outer physical ones. It avoids the aggregate becoming some unknowable Kantian thing in itself. It really forces us to think, though. How do we square this complex picture reality as ultimately simple, mind-like monads, but structured into real interacting aggregates we perceive as extended with our everyday experience? Can language and perception truly bridge that gap without fundamentally distorting the underlying reality? Or is the distortion part of how we necessarily grasp it? Okay, let's pivot now to one of the most fascinating and challenging parts of Leibniz's system, animals. He calls them corporeal substances or composite substances, and they seem to pose a real problem for purely idealist interpretations. They just feel so much more real and unified than a pile of sand.
They absolutely do. And if animals are genuine substances, genuine unities, then they compete directly with monads for the title of ultimate reality. That's a huge issue for any view that wants monads to be the only true substances. Idealism, which tends to treat aggregates as mind-dependent phenomena, logically runs into trouble here. Organic bodies are just very complex aggregates, right? So under idealism, they too should be mind-dependent appearances, making animals merely well-founded phenomena or mental constructs.
But that seems completely at odds with how Leibniz talks about animals. He emphasizes their reality, their perfect unity, calls them natural machines that are always living.
Exactly. It's a major point of tension. Consequently, many commentators who favor a strict idealist reading have essentially written off animals. They argue maybe it was an early idea he dropped or just an inconsistency, a botch in his later system. But Leibniz himself doesn't seem bothered. He casually mentions animals as real composite substances right alongside monads in his mature writings. He clearly thought they could coexist somehow.
This really raises the stakes, doesn't it? Our whole understanding of life, of ourselves even, seems to hang on whether animals are truly unified, mind-independent substances, or just complex phenomena. It's not just abstract metaphysics, it touches on the nature of life itself. So how does an idealist interpretation even try to account for animals? Can the well-founded phenomena approach work here?
Well, they try to extend it. In this framework, an animal becomes a well-founded phenomenon, P, just like any other aggregate appearance. This phenomenon, P, is said to be quasi-caused by an underlying monadic machine, a collection of monads arranged in a highly organized machine-like way. This monadic machine is part of a larger nested structure, a natural machine, and the whole thing is supposedly unified or dominated by a special, higher-level dominant monad, which acts like the animal's soul. The animal phenomenon is then perceived by some observing monad.
So it's a phenomenon grounded in this complex hierarchical structure of monads held together by quasi-causation and a dominant monad. It sounds intricate. Does it work?
Honestly, the fit feels very forced and unnatural when you look closely. First, that machine-like structure between supposedly world-apart monads relies on quasi-constitution. As we said, that's just a weak Cambridge relation, not real interaction or binding. How do isolated monads form a real machine? It's vague. Second, the whole setup remains largely irrelevant to our knowledge of animals. Because of the blockade between the knowing mind and the supposed mind-independent reality, you can never actually know the monadic machine itself, only the phenomenon P. Third, even if you granted the mind-independent monadic machine, it would just be a scattered object, a collection of separate monads. Leibniz's claim that animals have perfect unity becomes frankly laughable under this interpretation. A machine made of windowless monads isn't truly one thing. And finally, the phenomenon P itself, being just a mental appearance, can't really be the subject of life, death, or persistence in the way we understand animals. Appearances don't live. This attempt to cram animals into the idealist box really shows the strain. The price of maintaining pure idealism here seems nearly unpayable. It just doesn't capture the robust reality Leibniz attributes to animals.
Yeah, it feels like you're losing the very thing you're trying to explain, the living unified animal. So you have to ask, can a machine that's only a phenomenon, however well-founded, truly support the idea of an enduring living animal? Or do you need something more substantial, something genuinely real and unified? Idealism seems to struggle profoundly here. Given how much trouble idealism has with animals, let's explore the realist alternative. This view talks about animals as variable embodiments, constituting a second class of per se unities alongside monads. This sounds much more substantial.
It is. This realist approach builds directly on the rigid embodiment analysis we discussed for aggregates. An animal isn't seen as a single static thing, but rather as being tracked through a series of rigid embodiments. It's changing organic bodies over time. What maintains the animal's identity through all this change, all the turnover of cells and matter, is the complete concept residing within its dominant monad, its soul. This dominant monad ensures the animal has an uninterrupted embodiment, guaranteeing continuity even as the specific substances making up its body change constantly. That's why it's a variable embodiment. The matter varies, the identity persists.
So the dominant monad acts like a thread, stringing together the beads of the animal's successive physical states, ensuring it remains the same animal.
That's a good way to put it. And these successive bodies are embodiment machines, or natural machines. Rigid embodiments whose constituent substances maintain that complex machine-like structure. Crucially, in this realist view, these machines are real, active, and have force. The animal itself, then, is conceived as a D1N. That's shorthand for a divine fusion of a substantial form, the D1, the dominant monad or soul, and matter, the N, its natural machine or organic body. This fusion creates a perfect unity, making the animal a genuine single being.
Divine fusion. That sounds pretty radical. Does this mean animals are simple, like monads?
That's the radical claim, yes. Their apparent complexity is somehow miraculously done away by this divine act of fusion, making them metaphysically simple, or at least perfectly unified. And this means they are indestructible and ingenerable. They can't be created from parts or destroyed into parts. Reproduction isn't making something new, it's just the transformation of a pre-existing tiny animalcule already divinely fused at creation. All non-rational animals, for Leibniz, were created by God as these perfect unities right at the beginning.
Wow, that elevates animals to an incredibly fundamental status. What are the advantages of this realist account within the whole system?
Well, it fits perfectly with theory-pluralism, giving animals a proper home within the realist theory. It satisfies the simples rule, the dominant monad provides individuation, and the body's properties supervene intelligibly on its constituent substances via the embodiment relation. It also makes perfect sense of those texts where Leibniz says aggregates are actually divided into substances, namely into animals and other fundamental composites, and allows the whole aggregate thesis, bodies depend on substances, to really pay off and explain the mature system in a way the idealist analyses struggle to.
It's definitely a compelling, if metaphysically demanding, vision. It really makes you ponder. Is it more satisfying philosophically to have an explanation that grants living beings this kind of genuine, substantial unity, even if it requires something as mysterious as a divine fusion? The realist view offers a powerful, unified picture, but at a certain metaphysical cost. Okay, we've laid out these two quite different pictures. Idealist and realist emerging from Leibniz's work, especially regarding aggregates and animals. They often seem to contradict each other, so the obvious next step is to ask, can they be reconciled? Is there a compatibilist road that brings these warring factions together into one single, coherent system?
That's certainly been the goal for many Leibniz scholars. They try to construct a philosophical reconciliation that smooths over all the apparent tensions, resulting in one consistent, mature Leibnizian system. But any successful compatibilist theory would have to meet some pretty strict conditions. It needs to be textually inclusive, accounting for all the different kinds of statements Leibniz makes. It needs an explicit, non-metaphorical explanation of how idealism and realism are actually compatible. It must avoid equivocation, using key terms like body or aggregate in slippery ways. It needs to solve the continuum problem, discrete monads versus continuous phenomena, and it has to fully integrate the doctrine of animals.
That sounds incredibly difficult, like trying to square a circle.
Yeah.
What are the main roadblocks these reconciliation attempts usually hit?
They face huge hurdles. One common strategy involves what you might call metaphorical inclusion. Compatibilists often take realist-sounding claims like force being in a body or substances being in aggregates and interpret them metaphorically. They turn them into claims about our conception of body or how bodies appear to us, rather than claims about their actual metaphysical makeup. This effectively pushes the realist elements back into the idealist camp, making them mind-dependent after all. It kind of sidesteps the problem rather than confront it by changing the meaning of the realist claims.
So they redefine the realist bits to fit the idealist framework.
Often, yes. Another major issue is equivocation, using key terms like aggregate, body, or phenomenon inconsistently, sometimes referring to mind-dependent appearances, other times to mind-independent collections of substances. This inevitably leads to deep and rather obvious incoherence. For instance, claiming an aggregate is somehow both necessarily mind-dependent, idealist, and also a plurality of monads, which are mind-independent realist entities, just creates an unresolvable paradox. Something can't be both fundamentally mind-dependent and mind-independent at the same time in the same way.
And the continuum problem keeps popping up too, right?
It does. How can continuous phenomena genuinely contain discrete substances? That tension needs a real solution. And crucially, attempts to phenomenalize aggregates make them mind-dependent really handicap the doctrine of animals. They end up reducing animals to mere appearances, which, as we saw, is precisely the wrong story, according to many of Leibniz's own explicit statements. Compatibilism often struggles most acutely when trying to account for animals realistically.
It really makes you question the whole reconciliation project. When you find these deep, persistent tensions in a great philosopher's work, is trying to force them into a single box the best approach? Or should we maybe acknowledge that different theoretical perspectives might be operating? The incompatibilities seem quite fundamental here. So, if forcing a reconciliation seems problematic, is there another way to make sense of Leibniz's apparent contradictions? This idea of theory-pluralism sounds like it offers a different angle.
Yes, theory-pluralism offers a distinct alternative. It's crucial to distinguish it from truth-pluralism. Truth pluralism would be the incoherent idea that idealism and realism are both true, even though they contradict each other. That doesn't make sense. Theory-Pluralism instead suggests that idealism and realism are both possibly true accounts of reality. They are viable, competing theories or hypotheses about the ultimate nature of things, but only one of them, at most, can actually be the final truth. The inconsistency we see in Leibniz's text isn't necessarily an error on his part if we understand the conflicting claims as belonging to these separate, internally coherent, but mutually exclusive theories. Each theory fits certain aspects of the evidence, certain texts, in its own way.
So it's not that Leibniz was confused, but that he was exploring different comprehensive frameworks for understanding reality, like having multiple detailed maps, each potentially accurate in its own right, but showing different features or using different projections.
Exactly. This perspective actually highlights Leibniz's incredible intellectual open-mindedness. He could entertain and develop these seemingly discordant theoretical structures because the claims he made were often implicitly relativized to the theory in which they have their home. Think about early astronomy again. For a long time, both the Ptolemaic Earth-centered and Copernican Sun-centered systems were viable scientific hypotheses. Each could explain the observed phenomena to some extent, each had its own elegance, and each faced difficulties raised by the other. Neither had to be definitively the truth for both to be valuable theoretical frameworks in the ongoing search for understanding.
This approach seems to offer a kind of philosophical freedom, doesn't it? You don't have to pick a side and defend it to the death.
It really does. If you avoid passionate commitment to one theory as the truth, you can more objectively assess the strengths and weaknesses of each perspective. You don't feel like your favorite theory must win and the other must be completely wrong. It explains how Leibniz could say seemingly contradictory things, sometimes even close together. In the end, there are simple substances alone. That's true within the idealist theory. There are simple and composite substances like animals. That's true within the realist theory. He can make both claims without embarrassment, perhaps even in the same paragraph, because they are truth claims at home in separate theories which need not, for us in our current condition of ignorance, compete for exclusive allegiance. He's exploring the possibilities.
That's a really powerful way to view his work, preserving his genius without demanding perfect, monolithic consistency. It leaves you with a really provocative thought. What if the ultimate truth about reality is just too complex, too multifaceted, to be captured by any single perfectly consistent human theory? Could holding multiple, even incompatible, viable hypotheses actually be a more rational, more intellectually honest approach in these deep metaphysical areas where final answers always seem just out of reach? Maybe the goal isn't the answer, but understanding the landscape of possible answers. #outro. And so our deep dive into Leibniz's intricate final system comes to an end for today. What a journey. We've traveled through his profound attempt to map the very foundations of reality. From those indivisible, mind-like monads, the ultimate building blocks, up to the extended bodies and the living animals that fill our world. We've seen him grapple with huge questions: how quality arises from quantity, how unity emerges from multiplicity, how our inner experience, the I, connects to anything external.
And along the way, we've really explored those stark contrasts between the idealist readings, where aggregates, maybe even animals, exist primarily as well-grounded appearances in the mind, and the realist readings. In the realist view, we get a mind-independent universe where substances genuinely interact and compose real physical things, including perfectly unified animals. And we saw how theory-pluralism offers a way to appreciate this complex, sometimes seemingly contradictory, vision not as a flaw, but as a testament to the sheer scope of his exploration, presenting multiple viable hypotheses.
It really reminds me of that analogy you mentioned earlier about Brunelleschi building the dome in Florence. Just like Brunelleschi pulled together different, maybe even disparate, ideas and techniques to achieve something magnificent, pushing past known limits. Leibniz pushed through huge philosophical obstacles. He combined idealist and realist elements, maybe not into one single, perfectly seamless system that satisfies every logical demand, but perhaps into two main theories.
That's a great way to put it. Each of these theories, while maybe not fully meshing with the other, seems internally consistent. Each has its own formidable arsenal of metaphysical machinery, with lots of explanatory power and backup options. And importantly, that realist theory, which maybe got overlooked for a long time, really proves its worth when you test it against Leibniz's mature system, especially in making sense of real aggregates and, crucially, real animals.
Ultimately, Leibniz's whole system kind of forces us to bump up against the limits of our own understanding, doesn't it? If even a mind like his, a true giant, seemed to need multiple, sometimes clashing theoretical lenses to even approach the truth about reality, What does that tell us about our own ability to grasp the universe completely? Perhaps the deepest insight isn't finding one single neat answer. Maybe it's found in acknowledging the complexity and the intellectual humility that comes from continuously exploring multiple viable possibilities about the nature of everything. Something for you to definitely reflect on.